All right, good afternoon again. So thanks so much for joining in today. Today we're going to be talking about strategies for improving gender equity in the classroom. Just to give you a tour about the screen that you see in front of you, you have a couple of options there to let's see. Let me get this squared away here. You have a couple of options to take notes. To write notes to me in the bottom chat box. And I'm going to be doing my best to pay attention to that, but it might be difficult as we're moving through the slides. And so just hold those questions and we'll come back to them at the end of the hour. And so let's see, I'm trying to see what you all can see. Okay, I'm hoping that you can see the large screen on your screen. So if you're seeing the presenter note, please let me know. Okay, so again, we're talking about micromessages today. And micromessages, just a quick overview to get us started, are small, subtle, subconscious messages that we send and receive when we interact with others, and they have a really big impact on our students. And so today, the goal for this hour is to help you be able to understand and define what micromessages are, including the types of communication cues in which they most often manifest, and then ultimately to identify how these messages can improve equity and enhance student engagement in our classrooms or in our institutions. So I want to throw out there first, like, what are cultural stereotypes, right? So we know what stereotypes are. We know that they exist, and they exist in many different ways. But I want you to begin thinking about what are some of the cultural stereotypes that are related to our students and their experiences in selecting careers and the pathways to those various careers. And so look at this image here. So this first image is of a bag. It's a bag that's got a little boy's name on it. It's got a soccer ball. The heading says super light, superhero tough. And you see that he's got in his book bag some books and a little shark keychain. So there's some subtle messages sent here. You could think about how our children are sort of gendered to be sports and athletes, that boys are to be superheroes. And then the next image gives the contrasting image, and this was a true picture from a Lands' End catalog a couple of years ago. And here you've got a purple bag, again, sort of gendered colors. Chloe here doesn't have a sports object on her bag. She's got a water bottle. She doesn't have any books. And the heading says, light as a feather, tough as long division. And so you'll see between these two images that we're perpetuating some cultural stereotypes that boys are supposed to be tough, and that boys are supposed to be athletes, and that girls are supposed to be weak and maybe not so interested or struggle with math. And so to take that a little bit further, look at some of the images that our young students can get in the world. These are from modern day T-shirts. The first one says, I'm too pretty to do math. The next one, who needs math when you're already a 10? The third one is, I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me. The next one, my best subjects, shopping, music, dancing, all those are checked. And then the last one says, math, not checked. Well, nobody's perfect, the shirt says. And then the fifth shirt says, allergic to algebra, right? So when we think about the messages that our students are receiving throughout life, sometimes it's easy to think, wow, it's 2015, we don't have a problem anymore. But when messages like this permeate through media, they permeate through clothing and social and pop culture, these messages become really, really obvious and begin to send messages to what we believe we can and can't do. When we look at careers, we see the same kinds of images, right? The cultural stereotypes about who gets to be a car mechanic and what's appropriate. We've got cartoon images like Dilbert, who represent the engineering discipline, and some really old and stale stereotypes about the type of person that gets to be an engineer. Then Then we have TV shows like The Big Bang Theory, who represent STEM and science as, hyper nerdy. And then you've got, if you look and break down the different characters in the show, you can see that, the pretty girl's in front, and she's, the one that's not the scientist, right? And so you see this imagery throughout the world. We've got the Geek Squad, who perpetuates, again, the nerdy image. And then with nurses, right? I mean, we just have a cultural stereotype that nurses are typically women. And these are the messages that our students are receiving about what are appropriate careers, and it's perpetuating images that may not be interesting to most of our students. And so I want to challenge you to think, what were the cultural stereotypes that you noticed in the image? But most importantly, what is the impact of these cultural stereotypes on our students? Think about that, and think about the images that your students are receiving, whether they're receiving them through the media, whether they're receiving them through their home life, or through the messages that your institution displays. So I want to introduce you to this framework. And so we start with this. We start with the cultural stereotypes. And what happens with these cultural stereotypes, and yes, some of them are funny, right? We laugh at them, when we see TV shows and we see imagery that really perpetuates a certain brand as it relates to different kinds of careers. It's funny, but the reality is that these images, these stereotypes, come from somewhere, right? They come from this idea that stereotypes, while they aren't necessarily untrue, they are certainly incomplete. But these stereotypes then become biases. And these biases in and of themselves, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, that's how we actually function, and that's how we make decisions, and that's how we move through this world. So subconscious or implicit biases, these are social stereotypes that we form outside of our own consciousness. And these biases, they stem from our brain's adaptations. And what happens is, if your brain had to make every single decision of every single moment of the day, you would fall over because you couldn't function. And so what happens is your brain is making really quick decisions based on all of those things that are stored in your head. And if you've got cultural stereotypes stored in your head, because we all do, that's how, we function, your brain can be making decisions and making value assumptions based on these things that are inside of our heads. And so what happens then is that we can unintentionally be creating unconscious barriers in our classroom, because what happens is these interactions, they impact, and these biases impact how we relate to people. So let me give you an example. So the scenario here is that there was a national study of psychology faculty, and they were trying to evaluate resumes, but the question is with identical resumes, should there be any difference in how the faculty vote to hire Ruth or Robert, right? Okay, so you've got the same resume, but you've got one that says Ruth and one that says Robert. Again, the same work, same education, same paper, just different name. And so what do you think the result was? Well, the result is that 45% voted to hire Ruth, but 70% voted to hire Robert. But what's critical here is that both male and female evaluators equally preferred the male candidate. So regardless of gender, there was a gender bias for the male candidate over the female candidate. And again, there's really no reason for the bias other than subtle gender bias that permeates our workforce and world. And so this is just an example of how bias can influence our hiring. And again, remember, the resumes were exactly the same. So if we look at how bias is manifested within STEM careers, we talk a lot about micromessaging in this framework, because within STEM and non-traditional careers, it becomes really, really clear how these micromessages influence the participation of women and students of color. And so if you look at the statistics, right, we know that women and students of color remain underrepresented in many scientific and technical careers. And then even those females who do pursue technical education and other STEM fields, they're often stigmatized because such harmful stereotypes persist. In addition, females' academic achievements in STEM haven't translated into workplace parity, right? So if you look at the participation of young women and their grades in high school, they take more math and science classes, they have higher GPAs, they have higher rankings in math and science classes within high school, but that doesn't translate into their choice to go into STEM career paths, and much less the workforce. In addition, the culture of STEM career fields often creates circumstances that isolate and exclude persons with disabilities, as well as women and people of color. And this isn't exactly intentional, but because what happens is when you have a dominant culture within a career field, that dominant culture is just that dominant, right? And so by nature, anyone who is outside of that doesn't necessarily fit in. And so that brings us to a place where we are challenged to ensure that we are creating environments that are welcoming and inviting to all of our students. And so we can begin to challenge some of the stereotypes that exist in these spaces so that every student has the ability to reach their potential. So how can we identify our biases, right? So that's a big question. Again, this isn't coming from a place of criticism because we all have biases. But what we can do is we can begin to understand what these biases are, and then once we know what biases that we have, we can begin to identify how they manifest in our lives and our actions with others. And so one way that you can do that is you can go to implicit.harvard.edu, and they have a research project called Project Implicit. And this is an opportunity for you to take a variety of different tests on a variety of different topics to understand, what biases that you might hold based on your upbringing and your environment. A sample of what the implicit association test results might look like is here. So you'll get a spread of your results, and so you'll see that the person who took this test, they have a moderate to automatic association of male with career and female with versus family. So they lean towards the traditional stereotype. And so this is just one example of the careers that associates male with careers and females with family. There are lots of different other association tests that you can take, and I encourage you to go to implicit.harvard.edu to discover your own biases, right? That's where we start, is awareness. And so now that we understand how cultural stereotypes inform our biases, what we have to realize next is how those biases manifest themselves in our interactions with others, and they become what we call micromessages. And micromessages are small, subtle, subconscious messages that we send and receive when we interact with others. And there are two different types of micromessages. The first is microaffirmations. This is the positive micromessage. These microaffirmations, they build our students up. They make our students feel valued. They make our students feel included, encouraged. These are intentional messages, and they are positive messages. The other kind of micromessages are micro-inequities, and they tear our students down. And again, it's unintentional. We don't intend to do this, but they make our students feel excluded, devalued, discouraged, and they're negative and unintentional. So from my personal story, I'll share an example. So I'm an engineer, and I clearly went to engineering school. But I was in this program that was funded by Texas Instruments, and they were really seeking to encourage women to become engineers. So the sheer fact that I'm in this program made me know and believe
It looks like Megan was kicked out of the meeting, so if we just wait a minute, I think she'll probably jump back in and continue where she was at. So let's just hold on.
My computer the app just crashed, so give me just a minute and I'll be right back up.
Okay, are we all back online?
Okay, test, test. Okay, sorry about that. Sometimes technology fails. It just completely kicked me out. Let's get the PowerPoint back up. Okay, so I was in the process of telling you a story about my experience as a grad student, um, really where I was experiencing micro messages. And so again, I was telling you that I was in this program that was designed to help me succeed and to help me to become an engineer. And so one of my professors, this man that I just care really so much about because he was really influential in my life, um, he again, like, he wrote this entire program, this entire grant for to pay for my school. So that alone was an incredible micro affirmation that he valued me and supported me and was encouraging me to succeed and to become an engineer. But what the reality is that he came from a place where he had, pretty significant gender biases, and those would come out in the classroom. And so when I was taking circuits class one day, there was this example of, hey, he said, hey, if you know anything about trains, raise your hand and, tell us something about trains. And so I knew something about trains, so I was the first person with my hand up, and I was like, oh yeah, I can talk about trains. And his response was, well, Megan, you're a girl, why would you know anything about trains? And so at the moment, I just like shrunk into my chair. Now, granted, I was like the only female in the entire class of about 75 students, and I felt incredibly excluded, right? And I knew it was unintentional because I knew how much he cared about me and about my success and about supporting me to become an engineer. But what happens is in that one instance, and what happens to so many young women within non-traditional fields, is little things like that happen over and over again. And it begins to make you feel excluded and like you're not a part of that space and you don't want to be there. But what happened for me is I was able to really stand on all of these amazing micro messages that he had been giving me over time. So when little subtle things like that happen, although it didn't seem so subtle at the time, when subtle things like that happen, I was able to really balance so the scale was tipped towards the positive, right? And so when those little messages came, it was okay because I had all of these positive messages to stand on. And so that's what happens with micro messages. They accumulate. So they can accumulate either in an advantage or a disadvantage. And so the message to us as educators is to realize, you know what, hey, I'm perfectly, normal, I'm human, and things happen. Just this past week, I was delivering some professional development to a school in Texas, and my mentor was watching, and she was, observing me. And after the workshop, she came up to me and said, Megan, I want to give you some feedback. And she gave me the good stuff first. And then she said, well, I drew out 6 really specific examples of some strong micro messages that you sent. And as she replayed them to me, I was like, well, geez, man, that's certainly not what I meant, right? But what happens is it's not really about what you mean. It's what the other person receives it as. And so we just have to keep in mind that if we continue to build up those positive affirmations, when we have those micro inequities that come out in our language and our interactions with others, we've got the scale balanced in the positive side to help outweigh those things. And so what happens after we have this accumulation of advantage or disadvantage, the student's self-efficacy is influenced. And so what is self-efficacy? Self-efficacy is the belief that one holds in their ability to perform a task. And so if we look at specifically where we're coming from as educators, so that may influence their belief that they can enter into a non-traditional pathway, that they can even take the classes related to whatever pathway that they may choose. And so our goal as educators is to help improve the self-efficacy of our students. And there are 4 primary sources of self-efficacy. And the first source is mastery experiences. And this is providing opportunities for your students to remember where they've had success and to help them build on those experiences. So I just finished my PhD this past summer. And I tell you what, as many of you may know, it's the hardest thing I think I've ever done. And there were months when I just really couldn't, I was doubting whether I was going to be able to do it. But because I know something about self-efficacy, I was able to coach myself to build my self-efficacy. So what I did is I made list after list after list of all of those really positive things that I had done in my life that would indicate that I could accomplish this task. Now, clearly, I'd never written a dissertation before, but I had done lots of other great things in writing, and I had seen positive results from those things. So I lined all those things up and said, okay, look, here's your history that tells you that you can accomplish this. Well, we can do that with our students. We can help teach them to coach themselves in their own self-efficacy, but we can also devise our classes so that we start the class and we say, hey, let's recall what we've done and what we know. And so when you put them in that place of positivity, you put them in that place of remembering and recalling the content that they already know, they're reminded that they have the ability to learn, and it puts them in a positive place of self-efficacy. And you can also coach them to say, hey, look at the little pieces that you've accomplished along the way that indicate that you can accomplish this task. The next source of self-efficacy is vicarious experiences. And this is really related to kind of role models in our life. And if we look at the participation of women in non-traditional careers, this one is the most relevant, according to the literature. And so what this means is that young women need to see people who look like them in the roles that they either are striving for or couldn't even imagine themselves in order to have the confidence and self-efficacy to pursue these kinds of things. So that means not only getting people of their gender, but finding people of their race and ethnicity that can help them really connect with them and say, hey, well, if they can do it, then I can do it too. And social persuasion, this source of self-efficacy, is really kind of grounded in feedback and the different kinds of feedback that we can provide to students. And the fourth source of self-efficacy is physiological states. And that's like, okay, if your student gets butterflies every time they have to stand up and present, then that's one thing. But if they begin to relate that physiological reaction to their ability to do something, then that will begin to lower their self-efficacy, right? So what you can do as an educator is you can help them to separate the two. You can say, hey, look, we all get nervous. It's okay. My palms sweat too, or whatever. Help them. You can relate to them, or you can just help them say that, like, this physiological reaction isn't dependent on your ability to do this task. And so what's really critical here is that if students have a low self-efficacy, it makes them doubt their ability. They are fearful of it, and they avoid it. But students with high self-efficacy, they are engaged, they persist, they perform, they achieve, and they have higher motivation and interest to adopt more challenging goals and have a greater commitment to those goals. And so again, micro-messages can be one of the most influential things that we can do as educators to build our student self-efficacy. So let's look at a quick example here. So here's a student, we'll call her Carol. And she says this to you: I'm no good at algebra. No one in my family is good at math. I don't like math, and let's face it, girls are stupid at math. So why should I try? Have you ever heard something like this from one of your students? I bet you have, right? Like, this is a really common response. And so what you can see here are different ways where we can spike out and help build their self-efficacy, right? So she says, I'm no good at algebra. So she lacks the ability to see that she can accomplish this task. Then she says no one, so that you can help her relate her mastery experiences to believe that she is better at math, and again relate it to effort rather than some imaginary set of intelligence, right? So the second statement says no one in my family is good at math. Well, so maybe that is the case. Maybe she's like inherited her parents' fear of math, because again, this is common for us to pass down our fears of things to others in our lives. But here, what she needs some vicarious experiences. She needs to see people who are good at math and who are like her. And again, when you hear these kinds of language where she's relating cultural stereotypes to her ability, we can begin to separate those two. So again, I just encourage you to think about how you can challenge some of the language that you hear from students. There's a handout on the screen that you can download. It's a handout about self-efficacy that you can incorporate strategies to build student self-efficacy. So you'll see just a snapshot there, but I encourage you to download the handout. Okay, so now we've talked about self-efficacy and one's belief that they can or cannot accomplish a task. And what ultimately happens is that influences behavior. And if we know what's influencing behavior, right, so we have the ability to adjust some of these things. But if all of the young women or all of the young men continue to choose careers that are aligned with the cultural stereotypes, it just reinforces it, right? So if I hadn't become an engineer, or if all of the other women hadn't become engineers, we are essentially just repeating the cultural stereotypes. So what we want to do is we want to be able to help our students begin to transform this cycle. And what we propose is that the point of interruption is right here at micromessages. So we can come to understand our bias, but then begin to work and reflect and change how we interact with students. So when we understand how our biases manifest themselves in our interactions, how they manifest themselves in our curriculum, in our classroom environment, this is really where we can begin to transform our students and make a difference in their ability to pursue non-traditional pathways. And so ultimately, why think about micromessaging? So as teachers and advisors, I've never met a teacher or advisor or professor who was intent on ruining their students' lives, right? Like, we always intend good things. But what happens is between our intent, there are micromessages that we are sending. And those impact students and ultimately their performance, their outcomes, their engagement, their persistence in these pathways. And so it's important for us to realize that impact is more important than intent. So if we, even though, again, we intend to send the most positive messages of support and encouragement to our students, we have to realize that this point of interruption are the micro messages, and that those might be meaning something totally different than what we intend to our students, and that's going to have the greater impact on their lives. So let's look at the key micromessaging elements. So the first one is verbal. Verbal is what is said, like strictly the words that you're saying. So a silly example. If my mom says, "Hey, Megan, do you like my haircut?" I can say, "Yeah, it's great. I really like it." Or the paraverbal is like how it's said. I could say, "Oh, yeah, it's great, Mom. It looks pretty good." That's sending a different message, right? Nonverbal is clear, right? Your body language that you're sending. Contextual and omission are similar in that there's something missing from the scenario. So I'll give you an example. The school where I did my dissertation data collection had, it was a high school, and it was a project lead the way class, and they had a bunch of robots on the shelves, and they had, I don't know, like a dozen different robots. And I was, as a part of my research, I had to do like an environmental scan, and I realized that all of the robots were named with male names. And so I asked the female engineer teacher, I said, "Hey, like, have you ever thought about like maybe naming some of the robots with girl names?" And she just was completely oblivious, right? Like, she didn't even think about it. But what happens there is the message that the robots don't have girls' names is a subtle micro message that says that, okay, I'm excluded, I'm not part of this space. And again, those messages, while they can be so small, they accumulate to make a really big difference. And then the fifth key micromessaging element is feedback messages. And there's research to indicate that both male and female teachers are more likely to give feedback to female students about how pretty their work is versus the quality and effort put in the work. So specifically looking at engineering notebooks, this is the research that I've read specific to this, is it's really critical that we understand that we have these biases about, young women and men, and or just men and women, and this idea that you're pretty or you work hard, and we make sure that we don't use those messages in how we give feedback, right? So we make sure that we give feedback based on to young women evenly about their effort, but then to young men too. Like, we want to applaud their creativity and their ability to design cool things as well. And so these are the 6 key micro-messaging elements. And we'll do a quick little activity here to guess the element. So the first one, the cue is this. This is what would happen in your classroom. That you wait longer for men's answers than women's answers. And so what might the element be? That could be paraverbal. The next example is you would discipline men more than women for similar behavior. And what might that be? That would be criticism. The third one is that you avoid eye contact with female-male students, or vice versa. You only look at male-female students. That would be nonverbal. 4, consistent use of generic he or man to represent both men and women. What is that? That's verbal. Use only males as examples of scientists. That's contextual. And then the last one is that you don't tolerate women calling out answers, but you tolerate that behavior from men. That would be a sign of omission. And so something that you can do as homework is to download the handout and the box on the screen that has micro inequities and cues. And you can learn about how micromessages can manifest in our language and interaction, specifically within the classrooms. Because ultimately, for all the cues, all the things that we are doing in the classroom, again, like we may intend one thing, but they may be sending really different messages. And so I encourage you to look up this paper and the handouts. And so the first one, just as an example, I don't know if any of you watched the Super Bowl or if you've seen the commercial flying around, but there was a commercial by Always that that demonstrated this idea of like you do something like a girl, and it talked about the really subtle messages that we get throughout life. And so that's something that I would encourage you to look at too. It's a really great and powerful, meaningful commercial about these subtle messages that we can send. We say, oh, you throw like a girl, it's a joke, it's silly. But then when the producers ask the young boy in the video, hey, like when you say you throw like a girl, do you think that you're talking about your sister? And he says, oh, no, I'm not talking about her, right? Like I'm not offending her. But then the reality is like those messages are really pervasive, and they do begin to influence our students. So I encourage you to look at that commercial. I think it's pretty great. So if we look at the impact of microaffirmations on females in non-traditional courses, we have research to indicate that it increases their willingness to take risks. Again, that goes back to higher self-efficacy. They have enhanced creativity and innovation. They're more encouraged to contribute their ideas. They have increased levels in engagement in complex tasks and open-ended thinking. They've improved caring about learning, and they've increased interest in non-traditional fields and their development of their self-efficacy, right? So again, it really kind of comes back to micro-messages to build student self-efficacy so that it alters their behavior. That's really the loop that we're trying to demonstrate here. So how do you know what messages you might be sending in your classroom? So I encourage you, there's 2 handouts here that are related to peer observation. One is a guideline and one is a checklist. And what I have here on the screen is just an example of the checklist that you might use. And so use that. Like have a colleague come look in your friendly look in your classroom. It's not an evaluation. It's just to create some data points of understanding of how you interact with students in the classroom. A great anecdote to this is one of my colleagues, one of the initial authors of this curriculum, when he was going through it, he is a physics teacher, high school physics teacher, and he just believed like there was no way that he was biased in his classroom. And so he had someone come do a peer observation, and they were simply counting how many times he asked questions, or the boys answered versus the girls answered, that he called on them. And so now granted, like he knew that this was what they were observing in the classroom. And so despite the fact that he knew that his colleague was observing for this and that he was probably like overcompensating, he was shocked to find that despite that, proportionately, he still called on the boys more often than the girls. And so again, like despite our intentions, the impact can really be great in the classroom. And so coming to an understanding of how, again, these biases may be manifested in our classroom is really critical. So some super strategies, right? These are kind of the takeaways, things that you can do. So the first thing that we really encourage you to do is become aware of your own unconscious biases. And this is through observing your peers, asking your students, and videotaping your class. There is another handout on the screen about getting feedback from your students, a student observation of your classroom environment. And so I encourage you to download that and, ask your students, what do you think about this classroom and what kind of environment do you feel like that we've created? The next thing is to create an awareness of gender biased behaviors with regard to non-traditional occupations and preparations. But what's really critical here is that you directly address it and discuss it. The same colleague that I was talking about, the physics high school instructor, he has created a sense of accountability in his classroom. He talks to his kids about micromessages and what they are and what they mean. And he's created a culture where they feel empowered to call out these examples of gender bias in the classroom when they subtly happen. And so what that's really doing is it's empowering your students to sort of inoculate themselves against these messages, right? So if they learn to see them, address them, then they don't necessarily get so embedded in their psyche, right? And so, again, creating awareness and directly and discussing these in the classroom. Really learning to provide micro-messages that support student self-efficacy. There was a handout, again, on the right there that is for self-efficacy, and so you've got all the super strategies for each of the different sources of self-efficacy to help you build students up and to build up their belief that they can achieve in whatever pathway that they're striving for. The next thing is to, again, create a culture of affirmation in your class by not tolerating these negative comments. And again, this goes back to the story of my colleague and the culture that he created in his class. Really building up students and helping them to see that affirmation really makes a difference, right? So again, we acknowledge we're human, we make mistakes. These micro-messages come out no matter how intentional we are about stopping them. But creating a culture of constantly building students up will help to sort of tip the scale, right? So think about you're building up the positive bank, so when we unintentionally send negative messages, we've got lots to withdraw from. And so the next concept is, the next super strategy is that before you teach a new concept, have your students reflect on a positive experience that they had while learning something new. So again, this is going back to the mastery experiences for influencing self-efficacy. And what you want to do is you want to affirm their ability to learn. So if you come in with the pop quiz and you remind them like how inadequate they may or may not be or feel, you're really starting off on a negative note. So if you could think about a different way to start class so that they can remember all of those great things that they've learned and the ability that they've had to learn, that will set them on a more positive trajectory to succeed in your classroom. The third thing here is to evaluate your pedagogy and your instructional practices and to see where micromessages are showing up. So you can use peer observations, you can use student surveys, you can do climate surveys. And this is really key. And I'm very aware that sometimes it's challenging to think about the different pedagogical strategies that we use when we're teaching, because so often we're worried about getting the content out there. But if we can rethink how we're teaching our students to ensure that we're creating an equitable learning environment using strategies that allow every person the opportunity to really succeed and to reach their potential, we're going to transform the culture of the classroom as well. And so again, just begin to think about how you're teaching and the practices that you use to make sure that every student has a voice, every student has an opportunity. And it's not just around equality, it's around equity, giving those students who need a little bit more, giving them that leg up so that they can succeed as well. There's a couple more super strategies. So again, it really comes down to practicing recognizing and interrupting these micro inequities. And I don't expect that when we finish this hour that that your life's going to be completed and changed and altered and you're just going to be all aware. What really happens is you just start on this journey and you're like, wow, like, okay, this is a bias that exists in me and I'm realizing how it's manifesting in my interactions with others. And you start to stop those, right? So when you have these things that happen, you're able to address them. And so part of that means that you understand that not all things mean the same things to all people. But But essentially, we just can't let these micro inequities go unnoticed. So if something happens and you have some sort of interaction, you're like, wow, that is not what I intended, address it. Figure out a way to positively address it and change it towards the positive so that that doesn't linger with that person. Final takeaways are this, right? So we always want to figure out how to improve both our knowledge, our ability, and our commitment or behavior to take these new lessons that we learn to transform our practice. And the first one is this, right? So we want you to be able to identify, develop, and monitor countermeasures for microinequity messages related to women in non-traditional careers. We want you to be able to identify those micro inequities among various dimensions, so like the verbal, nonverbal, like omission, contextual, things like that, and devise micro affirmations or other actions that act as countermeasures against these things. So again, think of the scale, right? What are you going to do that's going to help build up the positive side so when these negative things do happen unintentionally, they've got the positive things to stand on. And then finally, this is work, right? Like it takes time to think about this, to process this. And we encourage you to continue to reflect on these messages, discuss them with your colleagues, and use the tools and strategies provided to begin to think about and transform your practice. So again, in closing, reflect on micro messages, send micro affirmations to your students, and send them often, right? So it's so easy to think that our students like, oh, we gave them that, they should be good. It's generally never enough, right? Because they're getting lots of negative messages from the world about their ability, their where they belong, and what they can and cannot do. But we know that every student should have equal access to and equitable access to a diverse group of a diverse pathways to all different kinds of opportunities and work, right? And so if we are limiting our students from going into high demand, high tech, high wage jobs unintentionally just based on the messages that the world sends our students that are from these cultural stereotypes, we're really limiting the potential of our students to succeed and to go on and to have rewarding careers and to support their families in a way that is meaningful to them. So you can conduct a peer-to-peer observation. Again, you've got those tools in the box on the right. And then I encourage you to take the implicit association test. So you can go to implicit.harvard.edu. There are a variety of different tests that you can take to inform yourself. And again, it's not the desire, the intent is not to create this feeling of like pain and anger. It's to create some awareness to help you be able to understand and address what biases we have, and then alter some of the micro messages and how we interact with our students. Ultimately, all great achievements require time, and this is a continuum of learning, right? The idea is that if with every opportunity we can begin to sort of move ourselves along the continuum of understanding and greater awareness of how our interactions affect our students, then we will succeed. But it takes effort and it takes time and it takes commitment and it takes reflection. And I just encourage you to keep on that path to further improving your practice as educators and ultimately helping every student to reach their potential. At this time, I'd like to open up for questions. So I'm going to drop out of the PowerPoint and then come back here to the chat box. So let's see, the chat box looks empty to me. If you guys have any questions, let's see. I'm looking through the text box to see if there's any questions. No? Okay, so I'm going to go back here. Luna, do you have some participants in the room that would like to ask some questions? If you have questions, please type them in the chat box here. Muna asks, what is my PhD? So my background is, in my undergrad is in computer science. My master's is in electrical engineering, and I worked as an engineer for Texas Instruments all throughout my undergrad and my master's program and at Texas Instruments. And then I worked for TI for a couple of years after that before starting my PhD in engineering education, and I graduated this past August from Purdue University. And so the work that I do really focuses on understanding how we can increase the participation of women and students of color in not only engineering, but moreover, just any kind of high demand, high tech, high wage jobs where they have traditionally not been represented. You're welcome, Muna. What else? Looks like Deborah Lemon is typing. Can you overdo micromessaging? So, okay. I want to say I don't think that there's any point where our students can ever have too many positive messages in their lives. Or not only our students, but us as individuals, right? Like while I was talking, I was really specifically focused on our students and our interactions with our students, but ultimately, all of us need support and encouragement, and all of us want to feel valued and included, and not to feel like we are excluded and undervalued, right? So, as far as micro affirmations, I want to say I don't think that you can overdo it. If you come to a place where you're becoming a cheerleader, like that's not what we're actually recommending here. We're not saying, go be a cheerleader for every student and stand there and say rah, rah, rah. That's not what we're suggesting. We're suggesting that you think really strategically about how you can build student self-efficacy and the strategies around that and their ability to believe in themselves to accomplish a task. And so I suppose if you're interpreting micro messages and micro affirmations as just being like, hey, you're so wonderful, yeah, that could be annoying to some people, but that's not exactly what we're recommending. We're just saying, hey, think about how you can build student self-efficacy around this concept of micro messages, because the micro inequities are strong and they're in the world all around us. You're welcome, Deborah. Muna says, I'm not using my computer, so I have not been able to download the files. Yeah, so I can email each of the files to Muna, and then she can distribute to all of you. Or I'm pretty sure that we have everyone's email who registered, and we can send those to you all. I put my email up here in the notes box, so you're welcome to access that. For those of you who are signing off, I encourage you to, I'm going to pop up a browser where you can go and do a quick survey. And once you go through the survey, you'll get a certificate of participation. But I'm happy to stay here and keep asking questions. I can turn on the microphones if you all would like to have a discussion about this. Would you all like to have a discussion? I can turn audio on. So at this point, everyone has microphone access. So if you've got a question, you can chime in. Let's see, we've got a question here from Rachel Jameton. Do you think that positive micro messages can outweigh major infrastructural biases like pay inequality, lack of childcare, et cetera, in the workplace? So institutional sexism and racism and things like that are really different issues. Well, they're not so different, but they are certainly big issues. And what we're suggesting is that as educators, as human beings, we have certain level of influence. And if you think about like what's in my sphere of influence, like what can I what can I influence today? That really comes from the space of micromessaging and thinking about how we can alter the biases that we alter how the biases manifest in our interactions. What I think is really challenging is the fact that the institutional infrastructure, to use the word that you use, biases that exist. I want to believe that positive micromessages can begin to chip away at that, right? Because there's still an ability that we are, working hard to address some of these issues. But if a person needs childcare, it doesn't matter how many times you tell them they've done a good job. That's still an issue, right? But that comes back to again a little bit larger of an issue. But what we can do as individuals, as managers of people, we can begin to consider, what policies and procedures do I have influence over, that I can begin to address with for my own colleagues and employees. Um, but I think what's critical here, and I'm not really sure who's all on this call, but it comes down to shifting the culture, right? And so if we can come to a place where there's some critical mass of people who believe that this is meaningful and that this is worthwhile, then you can come together and begin to really shift the institutional culture that you have. And as you begin to shift the institutional culture, then hopefully what will come is as influencing the policies and procedures that are reflective of some of the historic biases that we know. Does that answer your question, Rachel? Somewhat. I mean, I can't solve it for you, but good, thanks. What else? What other questions do you have? Maybe I can throw it out to you all. If you still have questions, type them in, or you've got microphone access to contribute. But think about. Okay, the music's gone. Oh, so I wanted to throw the question out to you all. What are some of the challenges that you are facing as it relates to micromessages, and how do you think this can apply to the work that you do? Looks like we have a couple of people typing. Again, the question that I turned back to all of you is how can this idea of micromessages and bolstering student self-efficacy influence the work that you do at your institutions? And again, if you have some questions, I still encourage you to type those in the box. Okay, so Dana typed a question in the box, and she says, I teach ESL to international students, as does a colleague of hers listening in. And she says, it's a major concern for us. They come to us with these biases already expected in their heads about us and how we'll treat them in America, especially our Arabic students. We need to diffuse what we can and build them up for success. I think this will help, certainly. That's great. I'm glad to hear that, Dana. Muna adds, for one thing, I can be more aware when I work with people in general and with women in specific. That's true. Um, for us at the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity, it's not a joke, but we certainly like take it really serious because we're still like we're humans and we're working together, and we think about like what are the messages that we're sending and what are the messages that are being received, whether we intend them or not. And it's just a constant effort. And again, like it's not the idea that we want to create a world of overly sensitive people, but the idea is that we have to be aware that things are really subtle and that they compound, and we want to be able to help every student have the opportunities to succeed and to reach their potential. And so by building up lots of affirmations and opportunities for them to believe in themselves and their ability to accomplish some task, then we will support them in those kinds of ways. Anything else? Moon adds again, the world has historically discouraged women. Even most recently, half of the world does not want to educate little girls. So everything we do helps. Yeah, I think it's really disconcerting when, sometimes we get caught up in our daily lives and we forget about the larger impact of historical cultural stereotypes that exist and how they influence not only us and our culture, but people around the world. And there's certainly a lot of opportunity for growth, and I just encourage you all to keep being positive and to have some belief that we can make a difference, even if it's just through one little micro message at a time. Well, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all, and I hope that you'll consider the things that we've talked about today and the action items that I've encouraged you to do from here on out. I will send the handouts to Muna. I will also send once we get the audio recording done, we can send you that link as well so that your colleagues can review that. I encourage you to take the webinar survey here that helps us to improve our program, and then once you finish that survey, you can get a little certificate of participation for today with the information from the session. Again, reach out to me if I can ever be of help to you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. And Muna, thanks so much for the Center for New Directions and for Lewis Clark State College for hosting this webinar.